My husband always kept the basement locked, claiming it was his woodworking shop. When I finally picked the lock, I didn't find tools. I found a perfect replica of the apartment I lived in before we met, including the clothes I thought I'd lost and photos of me taken through my old bedroom window. The copper tension wrench slipped in my sweaty palm, clinking against the deadbolt with a sound that felt loud enough to wake the ghosts of the house. I froze, my breath hitching in the back of my throat, half expecting David to appear at the top of the stairs, even though I knew his truck was miles away, splashing through the rain-slicked roads of town. The darkness of the hallway seemed to press in on me, smelling of ozone and wet earth from the storm outside. For 5 years, this door had been the one ironclad rule in our marriage. "It's just my shop, Martha," he'd say with that easy, dimpled smile of his. "Wood dust is bad for your lungs, and I don't want you tripping over a saw blade." He'd kiss my forehead, lock the heavy door, and disappear into the belly of the house for hours. In the early days, I found it charming. Every woman needs a little space, and I figured a man who spent his nights sanding down oak was better than one spending them at a neighborhood dive bar. I would sit in the living room upstairs, the clicking of my knitting needles providing a soft rhythm to the muffled thuds and high-pitched whirring coming from beneath my feet. Sometimes the sounds were different, a rhythmic scraping or a low, steady hum, but David always had an answer. He was making a cabinet, or he was refinishing a chair he'd found at an estate sale. Yet I never saw the finished products. Our house remained filled with the same department store furniture we'd bought when we moved in. "I'm a perfectionist," he'd shrug when I'd ask. "If it's not right, I break it down and start over." As I knelt there in the dark, the flashlight between my teeth, a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the storm crawled up my spine. It wasn't just the basement door that felt wrong. It was the way my life had been slowly fraying at the edges. Over the last few years, things had started to disappear. It began with small, inconsequential items. A blue cashmere sweater I'd owned since my 30s simply vanished from the back of the closet. Then a tattered journal I'd kept during my years living in the city, a book filled with my private thoughts and bad poetry, was gone. I'd torn the house apart looking for it, only for David to wrap his arms around me and tell me I was likely just getting a bit forgetful. "We aren't as young as we used to be, sweetheart," he'd whisper into my hair. "You probably left it on the bus or dropped it at the park. Don't let it worry you." His comfort felt like a warm blanket at first, but eventually it started to feel like a shroud. When my grandmother's pearl earrings went missing from the velvet box on my dresser, I cried for 3 days. David was there to dry my tears, suggesting that perhaps I'd misplaced them during our last move. He made me feel like my own mind was a leaky faucet, dripping memories and details into a void. I started writing things down, hiding little notes in the kitchen drawers just to prove to myself that I knew where I'd put the milk or the car keys. I was living in a house of shadows, and the darkest one was currently locked behind a 2-inch thick slab of oak. The storm provided the crack in the armor. A massive limb from the old oak tree in the front yard had come crashing down an hour ago, snapping the power lines like they were sewing thread. The house plunged into a heavy, oppressive blackness. David's brother called, frantic about his own roof, and David had grabbed his rain gear and his heavy-duty tool bag. "Stay put, Martha," he'd warned, his face illuminated by the flickering light of his heavy lantern. "The basement might flood with the power out. Whatever you do, don't go down there. I don't want you slipping." But as soon as the red taillights of his truck vanished into the gray curtain of rain, I heard it. Steady metallic plink, plink, plink. It was coming from the other side of the basement door. Woodworking shops don't have plumbing. There shouldn't have been a sink down there, let alone a leak. The sound was so familiar, so domestic, that it acted like a magnet, pulling me toward the hallway with my old lock-picking kit, a relic from my rebellious youth that I'd kept hidden in a box of sewing scraps. I applied pressure to the wrench, my heart drumming a frantic beat against my ribs. The sound was small, but in the silence of the powerless house, it sounded like a gunshot. The door groaned as it swung inward, revealing a flight of stairs that disappeared into a pitch-black abyss. I expected the sharp, dry scent of sawdust or the chemical tang of varnish. Instead, a wave of perfume hit me. It was lilac, heavy, floral, and unmistakably mine. Not the scent I wear now, but the specific discontinued brand I had used exclusively when I lived in my tiny studio apartment on 4th Street, long before I'd ever heard the name David. My legs felt like they were made of water as I began the descent. The flashlight beam bounced off the walls, which were no longer rough, unfinished concrete. They were covered in wallpaper, a hideous pale yellow pattern with tiny white daisies. I gasped, my hand flying to the railing. I knew this wallpaper. I had spent 3 days hanging it myself in 1994, cursing the bubbles and the way the patterns didn't quite line up at the corners. When I reached the bottom step, the beam of my light swept across the room, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. I wasn't in a basement. I was standing in a ghost. To my left was a small laminate-top table with 2 mismatched chairs. On the table sat a half-filled bowl of plastic fruit and a stack of mail that looked decades old. To my right was a small, threadbare rug with a coffee stain in the shape of South Carolina, a rug I'd thrown away when I moved out of the city. Everything was here. The small, cracked mirror I'd bought at a flea market was hung at the exact height it had been in my old entryway. I walked further into the space, my breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. This wasn't a workshop. It was a perfect, life-sized replica of my old apartment. Every detail, from the scuff marks on the baseboards to the specific way the kitchen cabinet door hung slightly askew, had been recreated with terrifying precision. I reached out and touched the wall, expecting it to be a dream, but the texture of the paper was real. Beneath the floral scent of the lilac, there was something else. A stale, stagnant smell like a tomb that had been recently opened. I moved toward what should have been the bedroom door, my flashlight trembling in my hand. David hadn't been making furniture down here. He hadn't been perfecting his craft. He had been curated a prison of my past, a place where he could walk through the life I lived before he owned me. I realized with a sudden, sickening clarity that the forgetfulness he diagnosed me with wasn't a symptom of age. It was a symptom of his theft. He hadn't just been watching me, he had been harvesting me one memory at a time. I stood in the center of my own history, realizing that the man I'd shared a bed with for 5 years was a stranger who knew me better than I knew myself. The air in the basement felt unnaturally still as I pushed open the door to the replica bedroom. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing first on the bedspread, a faded patchwork quilt that was the exact twin of the one my mother had made for me. But as I stepped closer, the light caught the texture of fabric I hadn't touched in years. There, laid out on the center of the mattress like a curated museum exhibit, was my favorite blue cashmere sweater. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and felt the familiar soft wool. It even smelled like the cedar chest I used to keep in my old apartment. Next to it sat the pearl earrings, gleaming softly, and the leather journal I'd mourned as lost on a rainy bus ride 10 years ago. The weight of the truth felt like a physical force. These weren't just replicas. These were my actual belongings, stolen from me over a period of years. A wave of nausea rolled over me as I realized the forgetfulness David had so gently diagnosed me with was a lie he'd crafted to cover his tracks. He hadn't just met me at that little coffee shop on 4th Street by chance. He hadn't just happened to like the same obscure jazz records or the same local bakery. He had been a ghost in my life long before he was a husband. He had been harvesting my things, my memories, and my very identity, waiting for the perfect moment to present himself as the solution to a loneliness he had likely helped cultivate. I turned away from the bed, my light swinging across the walls, and that's when I saw the windows. At first glance, they looked like real glass panes looking out into a night city, but as I approached, I realized they were sophisticated, backlit light boxes built into the basement's foundation. Inside them weren't views of the street, but high-resolution photographs of me. They were terrifying in their intimacy. One showed me sleeping, my face illuminated by the blue light of a television I'd left on. Another showed me standing at my kitchen sink mid-laugh talking to someone on the phone. The most jarring was a shot of me sitting on my old floor, head in my hands, crying after a difficult breakup. These were taken from outside, through the glass of my old life, by a man hiding in the shadows of the alleyway. They weren't portraits, they were the trophies of a predator. My legs felt heavy, but I was drawn toward a small desk in the corner. It was a perfect match for my old writing bureau, right down to the ink stain on the left corner. Resting on its surface was a stack of black leather-bound journals. I opened the top one, hoping to find woodworking notes or grocery lists. Instead, I found David's neat, architectural handwriting filling every page with a minute-by-minute log of my existence. October 12th. She wore the green scarf today. Bought a black coffee at 8:04 a.m. She looks tired. I think she's ready. November 3rd. The accidental bump at the library worked perfectly. She thinks we have the same taste in poetry. The hook is set. I flipped through the pages, the paper crinkling like dry skin. Years of my life were documented here. What I ate, who I saw, how long I stayed at the park. He had orchestrated every lucky coincidence that had led to our first date, our first kiss, and our wedding day. Our entire romance, every soulmate connection I had bragged to my friends about, was nothing more than a scripted performance based on data he'd gathered while lurking in the bushes of my past. I felt a cold, jagged hollow opening up in my chest. The man I had loved for 5 years didn't exist. He was just a mirror reflecting back everything he'd stolen from me. A soft, clicking sound drew my attention to a small shelf above the desk. A vintage reel-to-reel tape recorder sat there, its spindles turning slowly. I pressed a button and the room was suddenly filled with the sound of my own voice. It was a recording of my old answering machine messages from 20 years ago. I heard my younger self laughing, inviting friends over, telling a boyfriend I loved him. David had been recording my private conversations, looping them down here in his shop, like a soundtrack to his obsession. He didn't want a wife. He wanted to possess a version of me that he had frozen in time. Every perfect anniversary dinner, every thoughtful gift he'd surprised me with, had been calculated from these tapes and journals. He knew my favorite flowers not because he'd listened to me, but because he'd seen the receipts in my old trash cans. The betrayal was so deep it felt like it had no bottom. I stood there, surrounded by the ghosts of my own life, wondering how I had lived with a monster for half a decade without seeing the cracks in his mask. I looked at a photo of myself taken through a window I had sworn I'd locked every night. I could almost feel his eyes on the back of my neck through the photograph. I realized then that David didn't just love me, he wanted to consume me. This basement wasn't a workshop. It was a shrine to his control, a place where he could be with a version of me that couldn't talk back or change or grow old. Suddenly, a sound from above shattered the silence. It wasn't the wind or the rain. It was the distinct, heavy crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. My heart stopped. I scrambled toward the basement stairs, my flashlight beam dancing wildly against the yellow daisy wallpaper. I heard the heavy thud of the truck door slamming shut. Then the sound of the back door to the kitchen opening. David was home. He was home early, and I was standing in the middle of his darkest secret with a picked lock and a flashlight in my hand. I looked back at the Replica apartment, the windows, still glowing with images of my younger, unsuspecting self. The man who had spent years crafting this nightmare was currently walking across the floorboards directly above my head. Each footstep sounded like a death knell. Panic, sharp and hot, flooded my veins. I had no time to relock the door. I had no time to pretend I was upstairs knitting. I was trapped in the belly of the beast, and the man I had once turned to for protection was now the very predator I had to fear. The silence of the basement was gone, replaced by the terrifyingly domestic sounds of a killer coming home to his collection. The footsteps above stopped directly over the basement door. A heavy silence followed, one that felt more threatening than the thunder rattling the window panes upstairs. I stood paralyzed in the center of the Replica kitchen, my flashlight beam dying in my hand as the batteries finally gave out. The only light left came from the eerie, cold glow of the light boxes on the walls. Those glowing windows into a past I had forgotten was being watched. Then the basement door creaked open. The silhouette of a man appeared at the top of the stairs, framed by the dim light of the kitchen. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He descended the stairs with a slow, rhythmic deliberateness that made my skin crawl. When David reached the bottom step, he didn't look angry. In the pale blue light of the photo boxes, his face held a terrifying, serene pride. He tucked his wet rain jacket onto a hook that shouldn't have been there. A hook he had placed exactly where my old coat rack used to stand. He looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the peeling wallpaper and the thrift store rug with a sense of accomplishment. "You finally found it," he said, his voice as smooth and calm as if we were discussing the weather over breakfast. "I wanted to wait until our anniversary to show you, Martha. I wanted it to be perfect. Most people just have memories, but I've given you something better. I've given you back yourself." There was no apology in his tone, no shame for the years of stalking or the theft of my belongings. He spoke as if he were a savior, explaining that my old life in the city had been lonely and dangerous, and that by recreating this apartment he was preserving the real me, the one before the world made me tired. He moved toward the small laminate table, straightening the plastic fruit with a delicate touch. "Upstairs, you're just a wife," he whispered, his eyes gleaming with a detached, feverish light. "But down here, you're the woman I fell in love with through that window. You're perfect here." Locked away from the noise. It was the voice of a man who had completely slipped the moorings of reality. A man who believed that love was synonymous with taxidermy. My heart was thundering, but I knew that screaming would only trigger the predator within him. I had to be the woman he built. I took a shallow breath and softened my shoulders, forcing my face into the confused, slightly dazed expression he'd spent 5 years encouraging. "Oh, David," I said, my voice trembling just enough to sound vulnerable. I got so confused when the power went out. Thought I heard a leak. But the wallpaper. You remembered the wallpaper." I moved slowly toward the writing bureau, my hand trailing along the edge of the desk. My fingers brushed against a heavy vintage glass paperweight, a solid, jagged orb of glass I'd bought in my 20s. I palmed it, the cold weight of it feeling like a prayer answered. "I remember everything, Martha," he said, stepping closer, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the floor. "I've spent 20 years making sure I didn't miss a single scuff on the floorboards." I nodded, feigning a teary-eyed awe, engaging him in a conversation about the beautiful detail of the room. I asked him how he found the mismatched chairs, playing the part of the fragile, scatterbrained wife who was simply overwhelmed by her husband's devotion. Inside, my mind was a cold, sharp blade, calculating the distance to the stairs and the weight of the glass in my hand. I realized that to escape this cage I had to convince the zookeeper that I loved the bars. David's ego was his weakest point. He wanted to be praised for his craftsmanship, for his rescue of my past. He turned away from me for a moment, moving toward a corner of the room where an old-fashioned heat lamp was angled toward a pile of my lost vintage clothes. "I even found the silk scarf you thought you lost at the train station," he said, his back to me as he reached for a new addition to his museum. This was the moment. I didn't use the paperweight to strike him. I used it to create chaos. As he leaned over, I lunged forward and deliberately kicked the heavy base of the heat lamp. The lamp tipped with a crash, the searing hot bulb landing directly onto a heap of old wool sweaters and silk scarves, the very items he had spent decades collecting. The dry, aged fabric ignited almost instantly. A thick, acrid smoke began to curl upward, filling the small, enclosed space. David let out a sound I will never forget, a high-pitched guttural wail of absolute agony. He didn't rush for me, he rushed for the fire. He threw himself toward the burning clothes, trying to beat out the flames with his bare hands, sobbing about the collection and the memories. His obsession with the objects had finally overpowered his focus on the woman. I didn't look back. I bolted for the stairs, my lungs burning from the smoke and the sheer terror of the moment. I scrambled up the wooden steps, bursting into the kitchen and slamming the heavy oak door shut. I turned the deadbolt, the metal clicking into place with a finality that felt like the end of a long, dark chapter. I could hear him thudding against the door from below, muffled by the thickness of the wood and the roar of the fire he was trying to save. I grabbed my car keys and the one leather-bound journal I had snatched from the desk, the one that detailed how he had sabotaged my old car and scared off my friends to make me need him. The drive to the police station was a blur of rain and adrenaline. The sky was opening up, the wipers struggling to keep the windshield clear, but I didn't slow down. I sat in the fluorescent light of the station, shivering in my damp clothes, clutching that journal to my chest. I told the sergeant everything. The basement, the photos, the years of silent monitoring. The look on the officer's face when he read the first few pages of David's logbook was all the validation I needed. Within the hour, the quiet, suburban street was filled with fire trucks and police cruisers. The neighborhood watch stood on their porches in their bathrobes, watching in stunned silence as the perfect, quiet husband was led out of the house in handcuffs. He was covered in soot, his hands bandaged, his eyes still searching for the smoke of his ruined museum. The trial was a slow, agonizing exposure of a monster, but I didn't stay to watch the end. Once my testimony was recorded and the evidence was locked away, I left that town and never looked back. Today, I sit on a sun-drenched balcony in a small house 2 states away. There is no basement here, only a crawl space filled with nothing but dust. The walls are painted a bright, clean white, no floral wallpaper in sight. I look at a photo on my mantle. A new one taken by a friend during a picnic last summer. In it I'm laughing, really laughing, and my eyes are clear. I think about David sometimes, sitting in his cell probably trying to reconstruct my face from memory. But he can't. He tried to build a house out of my past, thinking that if he owned my history he owned me. But as I watch the sunset through my wide, uncurtained windows, I know the truth. He only ever had the echoes. I am the only one who holds the keys to my life now, and for the first time in 65 years, I am finally living in the present.